California is America's largest, most influential, and most powerful state. With a population nearing 40 million people, there are more people living in California than in the entirety of Canada.
Hey, I used to live in California, and now I live in Canada, so yeah, there are more people in California than the entirety of Canada. This is true.
And with a total economy size of $3.4 trillion, California alone would be the world's 5th largest economy, ahead of even the gigantic India with 35 times the population. The two largest engines inside of California that fuel all of this economic and population success are Greater Los Angeles in the south, America's 2nd largest urban area home to approximately 19 million people, and the San Francisco Bay Area.
So, LA, massive. If you've never been there, I suggest you go. Bring some freaking sunscreen. You're going to need it. San Francisco is also pretty cool. I lived in Redding, which was north of San Francisco, about 4 hours. We would go down to baseball games and that kind of stuff, football games every now and then in San Fran or Oakland. So, yeah, I've been through both of these cities quite a few times. My aunt used to live in Los Angeles, so in Glendale area. So yeah, California is a cool place to live. It's also really, really, really expensive to live there.
Further to the north, home to approximately 8 million more. These are California's 2 greatest centers of population and financial power, but traveling between both of them has always been a bit of an ordeal. More than 380 miles away from each other, about the same distance as London is from Dundee, Scotland. A typical
it's a long drive.
Los Angeles and San Francisco takes around 6 hours to complete, depending on the state of traffic. The only
6 hours if you're lucky to get from San Francisco to LA. I don't think we ever made it in that amount of time, because it normally took us about 10.5 hours from Redding, so 4, yeah, I'm okay, about 6.5 hours. But that way you're not actually going through San Francisco, you just go straight down the I-5. So, I don't know, yeah, 6.5 hours. It's a long drive, and it really doesn't need to be. So, this is why they were trying to work on high-speed rail. So, let's see why they failed at it, other than some of the obvious. But let's get into it. I want to see what Real Life Lore has to say here.
Only other real choice available is to take a plane and travel an hour and a half in the air across the 2nd busiest flight route in the entire United States. So, looking to make better options available and drawing inspiration from abroad, California back in the late 1990s began to seriously consider adding a 3rd option, high-speed rail, and it theoretically made a lot of sense. With other large and geographically nearby cities across Europe and Asia already connected by super-fast trains, it appeared incredibly logical to connect California's 2 largest population centers with one as well. With the extreme economic benefits of moving people between them faster, and the environmental benefits created by lowering CO2 emissions, the project seemed like a no-brainer.
Yeah, so as far as the idea and the concept, it's very important. It should definitely be done still. But let's see why it hasn't yet.
Which is why in 1996, the California High-Speed Rail Authority, or CHSRA, was established to begin formally planning the project. And then 12 years later in 2008, California voters went to the polls and passed what became known as Proposition 1A, that set the rails into motion. But the problem is that, ever since then, the project has pretty much transformed into a quagmire of catastrophic proportions, and has become one of the biggest embarrassments in the history of the state of California. This is the story behind why high-speed rail failed in California, despite seeming to make so much sense in the beginning. In order to understand how it all went so bad,
I think it went wrong because there were costs that they weren't expecting and outsourcing of private contracts to all these private businesses who just want to make as much money as possible. They don't really care about having a good finished product. They just want to make as much money as possible. They made their money more than likely, and the rail line never got completed. I imagine that's kind of what happened. It ran into budgetary shortfalls because the cost was ballooning out of control because of private contracts. That's my imagination of what's happening here.
You need to understand that most of the problems have to do with the fact that Prop 1A called for some very specific guidance for how the high-speed rail system was supposed to actually work. For one, it called for very specific routes and travel time requirements. Among these requirements were that Phase 1 of the project route must link downtown San Francisco with both Los Angeles and Anaheim in the south. This route was intended to be approximately 520 miles long from end to end and completed in 2029. And along the route in between, additional cities in the California Central Valley would be connected as well, like Palmdale, Bakersfield, Fresno, Madera, and Gilroy. Later on in the following decade of the 2030s, the initial plan called for expanding this route into Phase 2, which would extend track to the north from the Central Valley towards Modesto, Stockton, and finally the state capital of Sacramento. Simultaneously in the south, Phase 2 would extend the line across the Inland Empire region and towards the southern terminus at San Diego. Upon completion, the total system length would stand at approximately 800 miles of total high-speed track, a similar length as the entirety of the high-speed rail network of the United Kingdom. But where the UK, Europe, Japan, and China have proven immensely successful in building both functioning and economically sound high-speed rail, California would ultimately prove to struggle and fail.
This goes back to some of their other issues that they're dealing with: the homelessness crisis, the job crisis, the lack of health care, the failure of the California Democratic Party to actually pass a single-payer system in California that the vast majority of Californians support, but because Gavin Newsom took money from the insurance companies, obviously that's not going to happen anymore. These kinds of situations in these bureaucratic nightmares hurt everybody and benefit very few, so that we just end up in the same situation over and over again. Let's build something. They wanted to have this done by 2029. If this was anywhere else in the world, this would have already been done. It would have been done. It would have been operating. It would have been running through people. They started doing the research on this in 1996. And the proposition passed in 2008, and they were expecting it to take 21 years to build 500 miles of track. That's insane, dude. 21 years? I don't know about you, but I mean, even here in Canada, we can do shit faster than that. And that's California. It's one of the biggest economies in the world. It's kind of crazy.
And a lot of it is because of outrageously short-sighted politics. You see, propositions in California are incredibly serious business. Once a proposition is passed and the law is enacted, it can never be amended by the state legislature without it first going back to California voters again. Which kinda does make sense, but that also means that whatever is stated in the proposition must literally happen, even if it was extremely unrealistic or fanciful. And if you look at the details of Proposition 1A, a lot of it was pretty unrealistic from the start, specifically relating to the system's speed requirements. It specified that the trains operating on the lines must have an operating speed of 220 miles per hour, and a required total transit time between Los Angeles and San Francisco of just 2 hours and 40 minutes. That sounds great at first, but neither were entirely feasible objectives. For one, there aren't any trains in the world that can economically operate continuously at a sustained speed of 220 miles per hour. Sure, there are plenty of bullet trains that have shattered world records and traveled well in excess of even 300 miles per hour, but never for very long and sustained travel where efficiency is just as important as peak speed. For example...
Okay. So I understand that maybe there's a little bit of wishful thinking on how much we can get, how much speed there can be, and how much utility there will be in that line. And I understand how the proposition system works. It's actually one of the best systems in the country. I think it should be put in every single state, and if we had that in Canada, it would be very popular. I wish we did. I hope at some point we could potentially get some sort of proposition system passed. But I hope he doesn't say that they just basically gave up because their goals were too ambitious. I really hope that's not the case here.
In China, some of their quickest trains once ran at 217 miles per hour, but were later reduced closer to 200 miles per hour due to the hugely increased costs of running them continuously at those faster speeds.
Yeah, it's gonna cost. The faster you go, the more it's gonna cost. Honestly, if they could just get a 200-mile-an-hour train like they have in China, we would have no issues.
This meant that Prop 1A, in its original form, guaranteed that the California high-speed rail project would struggle to be economically competitive from the start. Moreover, the trains would also simply not be allowed to operate at these super fast speeds in locations where they would be sharing the tracks with slower commuter and freight trains, likely limiting their speed in such areas to under 150 miles an hour. Likewise, in urban environments and when passing through dense cities, they would likely be required to drop their speed to even less than 100 miles an hour. All told, these slower speeds that would be necessary all over the route's course would mean that the advertised 2-hour and 40-minute journey between Los Angeles and San Francisco was simply unrealistic. And it would be far more likely to be around 4 hours or longer, depending on the number of stops that would be built in along the way. These facts essentially...
Also, I love trains, so the fact that this hasn't happened yet makes me really sad, because I was in California last year and I would have loved to take a train up to San Fran. This is really sad.
Meant that it was nearly impossible to actually comply with the guidelines of Prop 1A, which has brought about lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit, as many Californians feel that they were outright lied to since the inception of the project. But it's not just the unrealistic expectations that make the California high-speed rail system so frustrating. It's also the incredibly strange routing and sequencing that the project has decided to carry out from the start. Obviously, you'd probably imagine that with the initial goal requiring the connection of Los Angeles to San Francisco, particular focus would have been given to selecting the most efficient route between them, maximizing speed and optimizing costs. But that's
you would think
pretty
so.
much the exact opposite of how California has actually ended up handling things.
That's really
It
sad.
was decided that constructing a somewhat less efficient route through the Central Valley would be appropriate in order to ensure that the 6.5 million people that live there had some access to the rail line. This included a decision to take a detour from the original plan towards the town of Palmdale, rather than routing the track more directly from Los Angeles to Bakersfield, a detour that cost an extra $5 billion.
$5 billion. That's insane. It should never have cost that much. But hey, you know, what can you do?
12 minutes slower, and all for a town of only 150,000 people. Likewise, further to the north near San Francisco, it was decided to serve San Jose on the new main line with completely new track, rather than utilizing the already built Bay Area Rapid Transit or BART system. Something that was argued about relentlessly and will end up costing the project even more money, all the while making the overall trip time still longer. In the end, what was supposed to originally be quick and efficient transit from Los Angeles to San Francisco and vice versa turned into a whole bunch of political jockeying, with politicians securing small wins here and there and adding extra stops in their districts at the expense of the overall statewide project.
So, if you're a politician, you have to serve your community. And if serving your community means getting your district a train stop, then that's good. The problem is that if that takes away from the entire project, rather, like, if you don't have line built yet, it's going to be a lot more difficult to actually add a stop when there's no line. Whereas if you have the line built, then ask for the lines, then ask for these new stations. Unfortunately, that's not how politics works, and unfortunately, due to all these delays, I don't know what the situation is right now. We'll have to just keep watching.
But if you thought the poor decision making would stop here, it's really only getting started. For you see, a massive project like this one really depends upon sequencing the project such that early stages could be used quickly, making direct impacts and prevent waiting decades on hugely expensive construction to finally pay off. For instance, the team could have decided that rather than laying a brand new track between Los Angeles and San Diego, an already fairly popular route, the already existing Amtrak track there could have just been simply upgraded. This would have cut the total trip time by 60 minutes and provided an immediate impact to commuters along this route. However,
that would be amazing.
The California High-Speed Rail Authority decided to instead build an entirely new route, adding an additional $7 billion to the total cost. And they haven't even started on this section yet. Nor did they decide on starting construction
They
on
haven't
any
even started
other
on it.
actually useful segments for the high-speed rail line like Los Angeles to Bakersfield, or literally any other pre-existing major commuter line. Instead, the CHSR set about constructing the very first segment of the high-speed rail line between Bakersfield and Marquette across the Central Valley, which at current estimates isn't even expected to open for 7 more years until 2029.
So instead of having the whole thing done by 2029, they're going to have this segment done, Merced to Bakersfield. I don't know how helpful that's going to be. It'll be cool when it's done, but I don't know how helpful that's going to be. You don't normally fly into Bakersfield or Merced, and Bakersfield is a decent-sized city, but it's not like, it's not LA, it's not San Diego, it's not San Jose. Merced's a little bit closer to other stuff, but
Population of only 84,000
84,000
people. You've probably never even heard of Marquette, and it isn't even ranked in the top 100 most populous cities in
it's a small town.
California. And yet,
for California,
it
it's a
is
small
slated
town.
to become the endpoint for the first segment of the California High-Speed Rail. The idea here is probably that since connecting only Marquette to Bakersfield is just so ridiculous, future government leaders will be forced and incentivized to go find billions of more dollars to actually complete the project to the end goal between San Francisco and Los Angeles at nearly any cost. Which leads conveniently into my next point, the complete financial mismanagement of the entire
Here it comes, financial mismanagement time.
project. From the very onset, the estimates for what this project would cost and the revenue and ridership figures that it would produce were just completely ridiculous. In 2008, immediately prior to voting on Proposition 1A, the CHSR explained to Californian voters that the entire 800-mile system, including the extensions to both Sacramento and San Diego, would cost upwards of $40 billion, and funding for the project would come from 3 sources. State and local funds, which has the Californian taxpayers foot nearly $10 billion of the cost, federal funding, which was estimated to cover anywhere between 25 and 33% of the cost, and finally, private sector funding for all of the remaining costs.
Hey, there it
as
is.
it was estimated that the system would generate around $1 billion a year in annual profits. However, all of these initial projections from 2008 have since proven to be completely wrong. Nearly 14 years now since the passing of Prop
14
1A,
years, dude. 14 years later, and they still haven't got this done.
The cost of the project has ballooned from $40 billion to nearly $100 billion due to delays, cost increases, and the
That's
slew
unacceptable.
of lawsuits thrown at the rail authority. Further, that $100 billion price tag is just for the San Francisco to Los Angeles segment of Phase 1, and isn't even to mention the
nuts.
Sacramento and San Diego extensions of Phase 2. And even further, the federal funding that was expected never ended up coming through, apart from a small $2.6 billion token of it that was made all the way back in 2009. The US federal government never ended up creating a high-speed rail grant program as was initially expected of them by the CHSR. And then
Yeah, so like they were just expecting things to happen that just didn't happen over and over and over again. They delay, costs go up, and now we're here.
And over the long term, once the system is actually up and running, it probably won't suddenly get any better. Once again, going back to Prop 1A itself and its ridiculous requirements, it states that the system is mandated to be completely self-sustainable from an operational funding standpoint, which means that it cannot require any local, state, or federal operating subsidies, which if the system ever does actually finish being built is not very likely because the CHSR authority way overestimated the amount of riders that would actually be using it. You see, high-speed rail most directly competes with airlines in markets where the distance between two destinations is around 500 miles or less. This distance is suitable because it likely doesn't take that much longer to travel by high-speed rail than hopping on an airplane. It doesn't require the hassle of visiting an airport, and it is usually a fair bit cheaper to boot. In the specific case of the Los Angeles to San Francisco route, it is expected that if it's ever built, it'll cost roughly 17% less to take the high-speed train than to fly the same route.
That's not really that great of a discount. I mean, what does that mean? It's going to cost like $70 to $80 to do? Something like that?
And when you look at European markets with similar operating dynamics, it has been determined that the vast majority of train riders will come from existing airline passengers who don't mind it taking slightly longer to travel in return for saving a bit of money. The only problem in California is that the CHSR is expecting that 75% of its riders will come not from airline passengers, but from people who usually make the journey by car, which historically has just not been the main demographic of people who switch to using high-speed rail. In fact, in more recent studies, it's projected that the number of annual passengers riding by 2030, when the rail line first opens, would likely be somewhere between only 23 and 31 million, instead of the 65 to 96 million that were initially projected. Alright, so where does the project stand today? Well, after 14 years since Proposition 1A, we have a high-speed rail system that is still under construction and has a very long way to go before it is ever actually operational. The CHSR authority hopes to complete the initial 119-mile segment between Bakersfield and Merced by 2029.
Good job, guys. You have 7 more years to get that done. Insane, dude.
7 years away from now. Extensions beyond these points, actually linking Los Angeles and San Francisco, are projected to be completed no earlier than 2033, more than a decade from now. And as far as the extensions to Sacramento and San Diego, who honestly knows? That's just so far into the future that it's effectively impossible to predict. According to a poll conducted just last month in April of 2022, however, 56% of Californians continue to support the project,
while
only
good.
35% are in opposition to it. By the time the project is over, the cost per kilometer of track in California is likely to exceed $55 million.
Jesus Christ.
This is a construction rate that is far beyond the $20 million per kilometer of track that it takes China to build their high-speed rails.
It costs us almost 3 times as much to build the same thing. That's going to be worse. That's insane. And it's going to be more expensive. America, baby. America. That's California, too. That's insane.
And still way above the $30 million per kilometer that Europe spends. But in all fairness to California, with its sky-high real estate prices, 3 major mountain ranges to cross and worry about, and soaring construction costs and inflation, it may not be all their fault. But regardless, the CHSR authority
letting them get away with it a little bit there. It's not all their fault, I promise.
Has a massive amount of work to do in the future. The success or failure of America's first major high-speed rail system is currently hanging in the balance, and it has a lot of catching up to do with the rest of the world. But to be fair, any engineering project like this has its challenges, and if you're anything like me, understanding STEM subjects like engineering or math have never come easy.
Alright, so that was a good video. Why California failed high-speed rail. I think that it will... Somebody who grew up in California, I think that this is unlikely to actually succeed in any real meaningful way. And even if it does, it'll be 10, 15 more years. people that were originally started on the project won't be the ones finishing it, and that's not necessarily the worst thing in the world, but the fact of the matter is that it's going to take us 5 times, or it's going to take them 5 times as long to actually finish this than other countries, other locations. There was some talk about some high-speed rail between Calgary and Edmonton, and then in the St. Lawrence corridor between Quebec, Montreal, and Toronto and Ottawa. But they already have existing rail there, so the question is, do you want to upgrade it? I'm a huge fan of trains. I wish we had trains everywhere. There is Via Rail. It's just too expensive to like take as a casual ride, and it's not fast. It's just more of a touristy thing. But yeah, I mean, maybe trains can make a comeback here. I don't know. This isn't looking like it's going to turn out very well for California. Hey, thank you for making it to the end of the video. If you enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell if you want to catch my next live stream that this video came from. Until tomorrow, everybody, have a fantastic day, y'all.